In the summer of 1867, in a valley 15 miles south of Sedalia, Missouri, an ordinary farm boy became the locus of a case that would haunt an entire county and perplex a generation of physicians. Timothy Caldwell was 8 years old when the region's only formally trained doctor, Samuel Harding, began to record what he called observations of behavior inconsistent with any known pathology. Over 3 leather-bound journals, Harding filled a cold, meticulous account of a child whose outward manners and inward life moved in opposite directions. Polite, attentive, almost painfully composed on the surface, and beneath that composition, a pattern of events no contemporary science could explain. To casual visitors, Timothy was unremarkable, even charming. He answered a man's question with "Yes, sir," and bowed his head at prayer with conscientious solemnity. But for 6 months, the Caldwell name seemed to draw calamity like iron draws rust. 3 people died in sudden, terrible ways. Dozens of animals were found mangled or dead under circumstances that baffled farmers who had lived their lives close to soil and weather. 11 names on 11 tombstones had, at one time or another, crossed paths with a child whose smile never quite reached the pale blue of his eyes. The record sat sealed in county drawers for decades, and for a long time the story survived only in the quiet corners of oral memory. But Harding's journals remained, archived and strangely clinical, a ledger of detail and dread. They reveal a darkness that asked questions not only about a single malicious will, but about the fragile assumptions a community makes about childhood. Missouri in 1867 still bore the ragged imprint of the Civil War. Towns like Sedalia had sent men to die on distant fields and returned fewer than had left. Widows tilled land, children ran households, and the physical and emotional economy of everyday life had been rearranged by loss. The Caldwell farm, once tidy and well-stocked, had been hollowed by grief. James Caldwell fell at Wilson's Creek in 1861. Martha Caldwell died of consumption in the winter of 1865. What remained was a parcel of land, debts, and a younger brother named Thomas, who at 21 found himself landlord to an empty house and executor of a ruin. When word arrived from Andersonville that another Caldwell had died, William, Thomas's brother, there came with the news both sorrow and burden. A widow and her 8-year-old son, Timothy, needed a home. Thomas took them in the spring of 1866, the boy arriving with a small cloth packet and eyes that seemed older than the cheeks that framed them. Thomas and his wife Sarah were not parents by temperament. War had carved hardness into Thomas. Bitterness had sharpened Sarah. They were farmers, practical and thinly patient. Timothy was small, fair-skinned, hair kept short for lice, speaking sparingly about his past. A soldier father, a mother who coughed blood, time spent with neighbors. What unsettled neighbors at first was not cruelty, but a peculiar absence of childhood. Elelena Patterson, who lived next door, watched Timothy work beside the fence with a focus that made her uneasy. He'd labor from sunrise to sunset, Samuel Patterson later recalled. Never a play, never a spill. Like a little machine, he was. Chickens would cluster and grow restless whenever he neared the coop. They refused to cross the line dividing the properties. Elelena whispered that animals, which lack the sophistry of humans, sometimes see things that we do not. The first death came on an August afternoon. Mary Fletcher, 5, the blacksmith's daughter, had a laugh that made adults look twice. She was the sort who wandered. She was found by the creek, shallow, gentle water, the sort that raises no fear. And it was Timothy who came to the Fletcher house with damp clothes and a steady voice. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." Harding, called to the scene, pronounced drowning. There was nothing in the body or the water to suggest anything else. What lodged in the doctor's mind, and later in his journals, was not the fact of death, but the child's account of discovery. Timothy recited the position of the body, the catch of the dress on a submerged limb, the hue of the water at the mouth. Details precise beyond what one expects from a frightened child. He said he had been searching for a lost calf. 2 days later, the calf was found grazing a mile away, healthy. At the funeral, Timothy sat with Thomas and Sarah, bowed and proper. He told Mary's father with small and solemn voice, "I wish I could have found her sooner." Yet Elena, watching from the pews, later noted that when the mother collapsed, when men wept for a small coffin, Timothy's face betrayed no wetness. His eyes recorded the scene without registering its anguish. 3 weeks later, old Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian who tended wild beehives along a bluff the locals called Devil's Bluff, was discovered at the base of the outcrop, his neck broken from a fall. Again, the boy's path intersected tragedy. He said he had seen the man's hat and called. When there was no answer, he climbed down. There were unusual details. Clusters of dead bees about the body, more concentrated than any natural swarm would produce, and the beehives themselves at the cliff's lip showed no sign of disturbance. Larsson had been steady in that place for years. Neighbors found it hard to believe he could simply lose his footing. Harding considered the scene and the boy's explanation, that a frightened man, stung and disoriented, might have tumbled. But the dead bees clustered only at the impact site, and the argument left a residue of contrivance. The doctor noted the anomaly, filed it beside the Fletcher case, and watched Timothy in the way a cautious man watches the weather before a storm. A month later, in September, the forest swallowed another child. 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing near his family's cabin. A search party combed the ridges and creek beds. For 3 days, Timothy moved among the searchers with endurance that belied his age, guiding men through thickets with a familiarity that surprised even seasoned woodsmen. On the 4th morning, he arrived at the Mills cabin just after dawn. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father. He led them to an old, half-hidden well a half-mile away. Its mouth obscured with logs and brush, Jacob lay at the bottom, alive but weakened. He was rescued and carried back to the cabin, but he died within hours of exposure. Harding's notes grew colder and longer. The boy's ability to locate these hidden places, to describe them precisely, troubled him. Even more troubling was what he observed at the bedside. While the Mills family kept vigil, Timothy sat in a corner, lips moving as if in prayer. Harding, watching unnoticed, recorded that the motions were not prayer but cataloging, breath patterns, pallor, moments of consciousness. When Jacob died, the doctor's journal records, Timothy's face shifted not toward grief, but toward something close to satisfaction. Afterward, Harding inspected the well again. What others had missed in the urgency of rescue struck him now. The rim had been arranged, the fallen logs and brush placed with care to appear natural. It would have taken work deliberate enough to conceal the opening from anyone who did not already know where to look. The implications steadied in Harding's mind. Jacob Mills had not simply fallen, someone had put him there, and ensured he could not be found in time. By the time autumn cooled the fields, Dr. Harding had begun to write with a new purpose. Suspicion alone would save no one. The child who wore manners like a coat and moved through grief without a tear had, in the doctor's view, crossed from coincidence into pattern. He began noting every neighbor's tale, every dead calf and broken neck, every chicken found precisely killed. He recorded Timothy's questions about anatomy and the mechanics of dying. the ease with which the boy absorbed facts and later reproduced them without the emotional fragments that usually bind knowledge to conscience. Harding's entries multiplied, each page a quiet insistence that what he recorded should not be dismissed as war madness or bad blood. Someone in that valley, perhaps the smallest among them, had learned to turn observation into instrument. And a physician, trained to see beneath wounds, began to fear the shape of what he saw. Dr. Harding's attention hardened into a method. He began to move through the county with the careful persistence of a man following a thread through a dark house. What had seemed chance now read like pages from the same book. Livestock losses clustered near the Caldwell boundary. Chickens found with necks cleanly broken, their deaths bearing the marks of deliberate pressure rather than the ragged work of foxes. Calves were discovered in positions that made no sense. Wedged, strangled by ropes in ways an animal could not have contrived on its own. Horses went lame for reasons that never healed. Neighbors mentioned seeing Timothy at odd times and odd places, on fence lines, walking near a pasture at dawn, tending to a field some distance from his uncle's house. Each testimony was small on its own, but together they composed a map of a boy who moved through the county like a quiet weather, leaving accidents in his track. Harding pressed gently in conversation until patterns emerged. Timothy watched medical examinations with a concentrated hunger, asking about fractures and suffocation and how long a body could survive without water. Once, fevered with curiosity, he asked Harding as plainly as a boy speaking about the weather, "How do you know if someone's really dead?" The question, recorded later in the doctor's ledger, felt like a scalpel. Harding began testing the boy with falsehoods, telling him that certain wounds were fatal, inventing details to see if the child would challenge them. Timothy stored each piece without surprise, a meticulous clerk of information. More unnerving were his questions about soldiers and battlefield injuries, questions that landed like pebbles against Harding's memory of amputations and screaming. Did they cry when their arms were taken? Timothy had asked, voice steady, as if assembling the last necessary fact. When December's chill settled into the lowlands, an excuse arrived that made Harding's access to the Caldwell household easier. Thomas had injured his back during harvest. He required daily visits and medicinal attention, an invitation Harding accepted under the guise of care. Inside the farmhouse, with Thomas incapacitated and Sarah burdened by worry, Harding found proximity to observe Timothy more closely. He listened to the boy and watched the small ways he arranged his world. Tools always tightened, knives kept within easy reach, questions that folded around pain like a student eager for data. Under careful questioning, a darker picture unfolded. Timothy had a hideout, a cave where he went to be alone. He spoke of it as one might speak of a favorite book. Harding, with the prudence of a physician who had learned to notice what others failed to see, investigated. The cave sat in a rim of hillside a short walk from the farmhouse. Inside, Harding found what every honest man must sometimes face: the raw, catalogued work of cruelty, animal bones, sorted, tools crudely sharpened and modified, a farming hoe reworked into a scalpel, a tin saw with notches filed for incision. Drawings lined the rock, an anatomy of cruelty rendered in a child's steady hand. Rabbits, birds, squirrels depicted with surgical clarity, margins annotated in Timothy's careful script, time to loss of consciousness, vocalization patterns, muscle responses. One note beside an illustration of a rabbit read in precise clinical language. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. What chilled Harding most were newer sketches. Human figures, children and adults shown in positions of distress, labeled with observations about breathing, blood loss, and the sequence of collapse. One image could be recognized by anyone from the funeral registry: a child at the mouth of a creek, dress snagged on a branch. Mary Fletcher. Another showed a man at the base of a bluff, the angle of fall carefully drawn. A third rendered a small body at the bottom of a well, limbs splayed. The cave did not suggest accident. It suggested study. It suggested intention. Harding left the cave with his hands clenched against a winter wind and his head full of papers. Suspicion, he knew, would amount to nothing without a moment in which action could be taken. The law required evidence. Neighbors required protection. He took what he had to Sheriff William Crawford in Sedalia, a practical man formed by service in the Union ranks, a man who had little patience for melodrama, but who understood the weight of facts when they were pressed into his palm. Harding laid out the drawings, the notes, the pattern of deaths, and the boy's strange expertise. Crawford examined each smear of graphite and line of ink like a soldier studying a map. "We can't lock a child away on drawings," the sheriff said finally, voice even. "But we can watch. We can be ready." They planned with the cold calculus of men who had learned to foresee violence. Crawford selected deputies he trusted. Harding rehearsed reasons for daily visits that would not look unusual. On a morning when frost had rimed the fence rails, Dr. Harding followed the plan to the letter. He approached the Caldwell porch in his buggy, head down against wind and habit. The farm welcomed him in unnatural silence. No cluck of hens, no steady conversations of labor. The whole property seemed to hold its breath. Timothy waited in the doorway before Harding had fully descended. He stood with sleeves rolled and hands clean in a way that suggested preparation rather than common washing. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," he said, his politeness perfectly placed. Underneath it, Harding felt an undercurrent, anticipatory, pleased. "I've been waiting for you." Inside, Thomas and Sarah lay in bed under covers, the hush of sleep false and too precise. Harding moved to Thomas, pressing finger to his wrist. The pulse was shallow. Skin had that gray pallor of someone overdosed on sleep. Sarah matched it. "Herbs," Timothy said, when Harding turned found in the woods. "Harmless things, arranged carefully." The boy's voice had the soft clarity of an explanation offered to aid a teacher. Harding's thorough examination found conscious life, faint and unsteady. Whatever Timothy had administered, it had been calibrated to remove struggle while preserving the window of life. Enough to render a household helpless for hours, long enough for a patient conversation to be held without interruption. As Harding and the sheriff's men closed the net, Timothy continued, speaking like a lecturer laying out methods and results. He described his experiments with a neutrality that erased the ordinary boundaries between curiosity and cruelty. Mary Fletcher, he said, did not yield quickly. He had to hold her until the panic slowed. Old Henrik had been easier to engineer. Loosened stones at the cliff's edge, a cloud of bees directed by a cloth, a well-timed shout. Jacob Mills, he said with an almost academic relish, was an experiment in prolonged collapse. Days of observation had taught him how dehydration shaped the body's last gestures as the boy spoke. He organized implements with quiet competence. Rope from the barn, a length of candlestick, knives placed at hand. He asked Harding questions whose aim was to map the doctor's likely response. He noted the make of the pistol Harding kept in his medical bag, down to its capacity, and counted, coolly, clinically, the number of lives present that morning. "Even if you shoot me," Timothy said, measuring the distance between them with a child's blunt logic. "You'll use up your bullets. How many people are you trying to protect?" When the first motion to intervene was made, Timothy moved with a speed that belied his years. He produced a blade and slashed at Harding, not wild but precise, cutting with an ease one would not expect from small hands. The struggle that followed was brief, animal, and uncanny. A child's strength paired with practiced accuracy. Harding fought. Deputies burst in from their concealed places, the house filled with the chaotic clarity of men trained to meet violence. They subdued Timothy. He sat in a corner as ropes bound his wrists, his clothing torn and bloodied, his face marked by the struggle, his pale blue eyes untroubled. "You can't prove anything," he said quietly, not pleading, but stating a fact. "No one will believe that a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford, who had seen men act worse on less reason, looked down. "Maybe not," he said, "but you're not going anywhere for now." Even captured, Timothy was his own witness. His confidence was a kind of argument the county would be forced to contend, not merely with the grotesque evidence brought from the cave, but with the larger problem the boy posed. A child who could describe suffering without feeling it, who could plan with the patience of a veteran and the cold curiosity of an anatomist. As deputies led him away, Harding realized that the community had reached a crisis none of its laws were prepared to solve. Under the weight of official procedures and skeptical minds, the child's danger became blurred by disbelief. When Sheriff Crawford and Dr. Harding attempted to present the drawings, the notes, and the quiet disturbances that had gathered around the Caldwell farm, they met the predictable resistance of a world not yet capable of imagining such darkness living inside a child. The county prosecutors dismissed the cave's artifacts as the scribblings of a traumatized orphan, grief rendered as grotesque imagination. They called the livestock deaths coincidence, the accidents unfortunate timing, and Timothy's presence at each scene nothing more than the compulsive helpfulness of a boy who wished to be noticed. But the attack on Thomas and Sarah could not be softened. 3 armed men had seen Timothy move with intent, calculated, silent, and efficient. A blade in hand, a plan in place, an aunt and uncle lying drugged and helpless on their bed. Even the most generous interpretations faltered there. Something fundamental was wrong with the child. Yet the law had no place to put him. He was too young to face adult prosecution, too dangerous for a church-run orphanage or the county's modest reformatory. No precedent existed for a killer who had not yet grown into his own bones. For weeks, the case twisted through arguments and consultations. Clergymen insisted a child could not be evil. Attorneys insisted he could not be tried. Physicians insisted he must not be returned to society. In the end, the case drifted into the hands of those who called themselves alienists, early students of the mind, most of them still fumbling in the dark. A compromise was reached. Timothy would be sent to the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton. There, he would be studied, contained, perhaps treated, though no one could define what treatment would mean. The decision satisfied no one, least of all Harding, who had seen the boy's eyes fixed on living victims with the same interest he gave to a dissected rabbit. Still, Harding volunteered to accompany him, and for 3 months he remained there. The journals of the Caldwell farm joined by a new set of observations, penned in bleak hospital hallways. From the moment Timothy crossed the threshold of the institution, he adapted. The boy who had never shown genuine sorrow learned to cry on command. He learned to speak of bad memories and dreams in a tone soft enough to move nurses to pity. He learned the precise moment when an apology became disarming, when a shy smile suggested progress, when silence looked like shame instead of calculation. Harding wrote in his notes, "The subject has learned the grammar of emotion without feeling its weight. He imitates humanity as one imitates an unfamiliar language, with fluency enough to deceive the untrained ear." More chilling were the ways Timothy gathered information. He questioned attendants about locks, about patrol routes, about supply deliveries. He asked nurses where they lived, who they loved, how often they slept. To one orderly, he confided a fear of the dark, simply to ensure that the man would keep a lantern lit in the hallway, giving Timothy shadows he could measure. When a nurse offered him paper and pencil for therapeutic writing, he accepted eagerly. His journal was read with relief by hospital staff. Sorrowful reflections, small confessions, childish hopes. But Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, newly appointed to the hospital and trained in European psychiatric methods, saw something off in the rhythms of his phrasing. With time and careful analysis, she uncovered a cipher beneath the innocent surface. Decoded, the entries were not reflections. They were reconnaissance. Day 19. Night guard appears fatigued during second circuit. Door key kept in right coat pocket. Day 33. Dr. F speaks softly when attempting to comfort me, susceptible to displays of trembling. Day 47. Evaluate trust building. Tears produce desired effect. Continue. What Timothy recorded most diligently were people. Their movements, their weaknesses, their sympathies, the ways remorse softened them. He was constructing a map not of the hospital, but of the human mind. Disturbances began almost immediately. 2 elderly patients died of what the hospital called natural causes, though both had been in good spirits hours earlier. Another patient fell from a stairwell railing under circumstances so unlikely that the attendants could offer no coherent explanation. Nurses complained of nightmares after caring for Timothy, dreams filled with images he had described to them in a tone so calm they believed he was recalling memories instead of inventing possibilities. Worst were the whispers that spread through the wards, patients waking at night to find the boy standing beside their beds, eyes open and expression blank. Some claimed he spoke to them in the dark. Others insisted he simply watched, silent and unmoving. The staff dismissed such stories as dementia or fear. Harding did not. 18 months passed in the uneasy rhythm of a building that had become a study for a single child. When Timothy vanished in the summer of 1868, the official report insisted it was an escape during transfer between buildings, a momentary lapse in supervision. Harding, who had come to understand the boy's patience, rejected the notion of accident. The escape was the culmination of months of preparation. Small privileges granted by unsuspecting guards, a few minutes longer in the exercise yard, unsupervised walks between wards, pages of books left unattended, had been seeds planted in soil Harding knew too well. By the time Timothy slipped away, he had cultivated every weakness in the staff. Evidence surfaced quietly in the weeks after. A guard who admitted to giving the boy extra time outdoors out of pity. A nurse who allowed him to choose his own reading schedule. Attendants who had unknowingly synchronized their routines in ways Timothy had subtly encouraged through conversation. The boy's departure was not a desperate flight. It was an operation. Harding wrote in his final hospital report, "He learned them as one learns the steps of a familiar dance." By the time he left, the institution belonged to him in every way that mattered. In the months that followed, Harding searched newspapers across the Midwest. Reports surfaced that stabbed like déjà vu. Unexplained livestock deaths in Kansas, a barn fire in Iowa, a drowned child in Nebraska found in water shallow enough to kneel in. In each account, a quiet, helpful boy appeared briefly at the edge of a sentence, leaving no name behind. Harding collected these clippings in his journals, each one a grim testament to a pattern repeated like handwriting. Timothy now had years behind him, growing into strength, into cunning, into the full shape of the thing he had always been. He would be harder to detect, harder to anticipate. And the world he moved through would never think to fear a young stranger who could look an adult in the eye with calmness learned in a hospital ward. Harding spent the last of his life tracking shadows, building theories, filling pages that future psychologists would one day study with reverence and unease. He wrote about moral development, about the possibility that empathy might not be universal, about a kind of darkness that did not need trauma to awaken it. He died in 1891 with his journals stacked beside his bed, the last pages written in a trembling hand that still carried the precision of his prime. The Caldwell farm was abandoned soon after Timothy's arrest. Thomas and Sarah, who had once moved through the fields with the confidence of people whose lives were predictable, left it behind. They changed their names, lived quietly, spoke to no one of the child who had slept under their roof. Neither lived long. Neither ever had children. The cave where Timothy conducted his early experiments was sealed with stones by Sheriff Crawford. But locals refused to go near it. They said animals shied from the place, that the wind there sounded wrong. In 1923, Harding's daughter donated her father's journals to the Missouri Historical Society. The archivists who received them understood at once that they were holding a piece of American psychological history, the first detailed account of a mind that lacked the machinery of remorse. Harding's final entry, written days before his death, was not addressed to lawmen or scholars. It was addressed to whoever would read it when the child he once studied had already become a man. I fear he was not an anomaly somewhere. If he lives, there is a man who wears the intellect of adulthood over the conscience of a void. A man who knows the architecture of fear, who can imitate warmth without feeling its heat, and who sees the rest of us as instruments for his education. If he walks among us still, we would not know him until he wished to be known. The story of Timothy Caldwell endures because it unsettles something we do not want to name. That innocence can be imitated, that childhood can mask something colder than malice, and that history hides its darkest figures in the very places we feel safest. Do you believe everything about Timothy was uncovered? Or is there more that the official record refused to hold?